Hello and welcome. My name is Daniel Orenstein. I'm the socio-ecology theme lead in eLTER RI, in the eLTER research infrastructure. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means as we progress. I'm also a professor in environmental studies at the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning at Israel's Technion Institute of Technology. Today I'll be talking about how and why eLTER RI advances social ecological research. And you can look at this also as a complementary lecture to two others that colleagues of mine have made, Dr. Jennifer Holter and Dr. Dan Dick, who both also spoke on various aspects of social ecology within the eLTER research infrastructure. The overview for today will be first why a unique approach to ecosystem research, why a different approach than ecology, the natural sciences, than traditional sociology or anthropology. Why do we demand a new transdisciplinary approach? And then I'll talk a bit about what social ecology is through the lens of eLTER RI. And we look at it both as research, a way of doing research, but also we emphasize a process. That is, it goes beyond the production of knowledge to include work with communities to advance particular environmental policy agendas. And those aren't set, of course, those are determined by the communities that we work with. I will give an example of how social ecology works in practice through a project that I was involved in with a vineyard for producing wine grapes, which underwent a sustainability transition. And we, as the social ecology research team, assisted during the process of our research, we assisted in that transition. And then I'll go back again to talk about how social ecology is expressed in the eLTER research infrastructure. I put two very suggestive illustrations on the screen. One is that subject that's on everybody's mind certainly in environmental communities and policymaking communities, the release of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change sixth report, which triggered a very broad response from the media regarding the emergency that it portrayed, the climate emergency, an environmental problem produced by humans, by human activity, and something that demands immediate attention. And below that, the UN sustainability goals, which are also underlie a lot of our normative objectives within the eLTER research infrastructure. So why a different approach? Three primary global scale environmental challenges, certainly not all the environmental challenges, but three very prominent ones among them. Climate change, represented by the ever increasing amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Biodiversity loss, represented by the minuscule portion of global terrestrial mammal biomass represented by wild animals, only 4%. 96% of all terrestrial mammal biomass is composed of humans and their domesticated animals, representing our widespread impact on the planet, and nutrient accumulation, in this case represented by dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico as a result of the accumulation of nitrogen from the central United States, from agriculture in central United States, flowing into the Gulf and rendering those areas largely devoid of biological life. So these are problems. They're very well defined scientifically. We can describe them. We know the sources of pollution. We know the impact of the pollution. We know a lot of the details, and we know enough probably to deal with these problems. So there's a big question mark about why we don't deal with them, or why we have had so much trouble preventing these environmental problems that ultimately affect our well-being and may even affect Nuts. Let's go back one slide. So there's a question mark regarding why we have not been able to mitigate these problems and why they continue despite the best scientific knowledge and the ability to define the problems and their impact. And indeed, LTSER wants to have an impact, a positive impact on mitigating those ecological problems, environmental problems. And what we discover is that good research and good data is clearly not enough to resolve those problems. There are social challenges, and the social challenges include the capacity to communicate those problems to the public, to policymakers, a problem of conflicting values of whether the solution to the problems are acceptable to the public to the point where they're willing to make changes or perhaps make sacrifices in order to mitigate those problems. And there's challenges of policy processes. Policy has to address multiple objectives, and mitigating environmental problems is not always the sole one, or isn't ever the sole objective of a policy regime. There's also economic well-being and health, and national security and global security and other issues. So we clearly have not been able to, at this point, stop those increasing threats to the future of human well-being on the planet. Nonetheless, resource use and ecological monitoring is absolutely important in being able to know where we are and where we're going with regard to these problems. And good scientific knowledge about ecological limits is also crucial. However, as Eleanor Ostrom and her colleagues have written, sound science is necessary, but not sufficient for sustainable management of common resources of global ecosystems. We clearly need something more than good science. And those things, those more things, are research approaches that integrate systems, social systems, ecological systems, knowledge that's taken not only from the scientific community, but from stakeholder groups, from people who live on the land, from people who are professionals in other fields other than academic research. Of course, farmers come to mind, natural resource managers, fishermen, shepherds, all sorts of other forms of knowledge are necessary to properly understand and properly manage resources. Good communication between various communities, interest groups, stakeholder groups is a necessary component of sustainable management. Social networks that trust one another, that can work together. There's not been a better time in recent history to show how important trust and scientific literacy is than the coronavirus pandemic, where we see tremendous difficulties implementing scientifically sound policies for public health, but that trust in leadership and literacy of the public to understand the science behind the policy recommendations is lacking. And that's a tremendous problem. And that's made the impact of the pandemic much worse. So clearly in any issue, including resource management, trust and ecological literacy would strengthen our capacity to deal with it, and participatory processes. Now, what are those important things? All those important things are actually part of what we consider social ecology, that it goes beyond the scientific monitoring, hypothesis testing, understanding how processes work, and it tries to incorporate both normative policy objectives, integration of communities who will be the ultimate recipients of the scientific information and who will be responsible for processing that information into policy, and doing that in a collective way where people can work together and increase trust with one another. So that brings us to social ecology. Social ecology, I said earlier, we look at it through two different lenses. One is the research. The research is the interaction between human society, social systems, all of their accumulated activities, and how those accumulated activities impact biophysical systems, along, of course, with natural impacts, which interact with the human activities. So that's part of this process. How do human systems impact biophysical systems? And then through a feedback mechanism, how do changes in the biophysical system affect social systems like human well-being, and then policy decisions and management and planning as a result of those changes in the biophysical system. So this is our kind of feedback system of interacting social ecological systems. And that's what kind of makes this discipline different than others, because it looks at these two systems as not two independent systems, but rather two systems in constant interaction, responding to one another in order to understand, on the one hand, our impact on the planet and individual ecosystems and regions, and on the other hand, how those changes affect us and how they affect the internal social system of our decision-making processes and policy management, etc. But there's also an aspect to this, which is process. And here I rely largely on a 2006 paper by Helmut Haberl and his colleagues in Vienna, which set out kind of the criteria for what differentiates long-term ecological research with long-term social ecological research. And I kind of summarized that in this table, including the difference between the systems that are studied. One includes the social ecological system. The other, when humans are dealt with, they're dealt with as an external part of the natural system that's impacting the natural system, but it's external to the study objectives. And whereas the social ecology integrates those two and also looks at the interactions, as I stated earlier. Methods and approaches, the classic ecology uses natural science approaches, hypothesis testing, excuse me, observation and analysis, explanation, whereas social ecological approaches tend to be more introspective, tend to utilize more qualitative approaches as well, and certainly approaches that look at the interaction between the two systems. The products are different. The products of classic ecology is to produce data, to produce hypotheses, to test theories, to understand how life works. On the other hand, social ecology is very objective oriented towards policy and towards problem solving. Not always, but certainly in the way that we're trying to implement it within LTER. And then there's assumptions about objectivity and subjectivity. Classic ecology, like many of the natural sciences, assumes some sort of unobtainable, which I'm adding my own commentary, unobtainable objectivity, because I think all scientists have some degree of subjectivity, but social ecology is explicit in assuming that the scientist has subjective opinions that affect the way they research a topic. And some of that subjectivity is offset by the inclusion of a large amount of other stakeholder groups and other opinions to integrate them together, where the scientist is just one actor within this broader community that the social ecologist is trying to mobilize in this research process. To put it more in a graphic way, there's two things going on in this process. there's the research orientation, and there's the policy and uptake orientation, and these work together. That is, the researcher consults with the public to understand what problems need to be researched, conducts the research, and feeds the information directly to the stakeholder communities who have to make decisions based on that. So the connection between them is very tight. And the active consultation and the active community discussion to set the research agenda makes, in theory, makes it more likely that when the results come about, the community is more likely to be receptive to the uptake, because the research in of itself was generated to meet questions and needs of that community. So, and this is also an iterative process where the research ideally is not bounded by a 4-year or 2-year funding cycle, but rather the researcher has a long-term commitment to work with the community, also to investigate the impact of policy implementation or management plans. Are they working? Is the trajectory going in the right place? What's the next step to study, and how can we strive for constant improvement, correction if need be, or improvement in outcome of policy implementation on the given ecological variables. So I'll offer an example. This was a very, very gratifying research project that I was involved in, and really the only one that I had the opportunity to build in the image of this concept of social ecology and participate in it from beginning to end. Unfortunately, just a 2-year process. It would have been rewarding to continue on, but in some ways it is continuing. So these are vineyards in Israel belonging to a particular winery. And the subject at hand is whether we can make this transition to bare fields, as we see on the left side of the screen, where the rows are clean, all of the plant life other than the vines themselves are removed, or whether we can have cover crops. Now, part of this may be trivial to communities or countries that have used cover crops traditionally for a long period of time. In the case of Israel, it was traditional to keep the rows, quote unquote, clean and devoid of other vegetation, because that sent the message that these are well-tended agricultural fields. And also the belief was that the vines are better off without the cover crops for various reasons. So enter environmental challenges in clearing all the vegetation from between the vines. Water loss, soil loss, biodiversity loss, excessive herbicide use, and the accumulations of toxins in the environment. All of those things are suspected to have been associated to clearing the rows between the vines. The trigger for our research is an Israeli environmental organization that said we would like to help facilitate a transition in the agricultural sector to more sustainable practices, but they are an NGO. They don't conduct research, nor does every other stakeholder respect their wishes and think that they have the right idea. But they found a partner, who I'm calling here a sustainability hero, in a viticulturist in one of the prominent wineries in northern Israel. And this viticulturist decided that she wanted to test whether growing cover crops would be ecologically advantageous, at the same time not cause economic loss to the farmers, and of course whether it would affect the quality of the grapes and eventually of the wine. And I'll explain later why I call her a sustainability hero, because I'm not using the term lightly. It's actually a concept in sustainability studies that I'll speak about in a bit. She, along with the environmental organization, recruited funding from another organization, a granting organization, that funds sustainability and agriculture projects. So now we have a funder on board, and they took on ecologists and to look for the ecologists to look at whether the growing cover crops would increase the amount of parasites, of parasitoids, that is, insects that could damage the crops, insects that actually prey on the potentially damaging insects. And they did their first research. And the first research, the first couple years, the results were a little bit ambiguous. It wasn't clear that the crops were in any more danger from harmful pests than they were when the rows were cleared. But it also wasn't absolute. It wasn't very statistically significant. Thank you. At the same time as those results, because as ecologists, or as looking at this from an environmental perspective, then we would say, okay, then let's grow cover crops. There's clearly nothing to lose and perhaps something to gain. And that's what the results were telling us. However, there are other interests in play. The winery has to, of course, worry about the quality of the grapes. The farmers have to worry about the potential negative impacts. And here it's very important to take into account that ecologists and environmentalists like to advocate for policies that will be environmentally advantageous, but if they don't work, they don't pay the price, whereas the farmers would. If for any reason disease outbreak or pest outbreak damage the crops, for the ecologist or for the environmentalist, that's not good, but we can try again. But for the farmers, that's a potential sizable loss in their income. So farmers have to be far more conservative in their approach to large changes in the way that they do their practice. So in order to have the farmers on board for this potentially advantageous transition, the next iteration of the research brought on social ecologists. And that was myself, and that was a partner that I was working with, a policy analyst. And we studied the interaction between these two systems. How do the farmers feel about these transitions? What are they worried about? What are they less worried about? Is this impacting the quality of the wine? Do consumers prefer knowing that there are cover crops or not? Does it make a difference to them? That is, we studied different social and economic components of this whole system, and our approach was to work as much as possible with the farmers to hear them and process their concerns. The result of the entire project, and I'm not attributing the success only to our engagement, although it is correlated, we were engaged and the policy was successful, that the farmers came on board. The next iteration of the ecological research was more decisive, advantageous towards a moderate rise in the number of parasites, but a just as large a rise in the parasitoids. So no greater damage to the vines, which is the most important factor. And there was a policy shift, and all of the wineries' fields were transitioned with the farmers' cooperation and support to cover crops. And that's a big success. There are other stakeholders now engaged. This policy continues. There was momentum established, but for our sake, that was the end of the research. But we had the opportunity to participate in this process. And this is a little bit of an involved table, but if you look at it, it's chronological from the top to the bottom, where the winery implemented this policy. The farmers were engaged, the ecologists did their research, results were shared with the farmers and the winery, and then the social policy research team joined, and the iterations continued until all of the farmers moved over to this new process, and the project was considered a success. To emphasize the farmers, these small words, if you can't read the whole thing, the farmers, the key words here were their ambivalence at the beginning, their realization of the potential advantages, their eventual support for the transition, and then watching the policy proliferate into the broader farming community beyond this vineyard. Regarding the viticulturists who wanted to encourage, that was their primary role, was to encourage the process. They did so by sponsoring the research. They worked with the farmers, and they were able to shepherd through this process. And they also perceived that it's good for their sales, for their marketing of their wines, which now have an ecological label on them. The ecological research team responsible for research and monitoring. And research and monitoring are two of the primary components of eLTER, prior to the development of a socio-ecological approach. So research and monitoring is still at the core of socio-ecological research. Regarding the social and policy team, their job was inclusion, discussion, consultation, dissemination, presentation, working with the communities, bringing them into this process. So at every step of the way, they knew exactly what was going on. They understood the science. They had contact with the scientists. We brought people together to present all the time and discuss, so that the farmers understood what the results of the research were and what the implications were of the research. I'll just give one anecdote about why it was important for the social and policy team to be engaged. When the work was presented to the farmers at the beginning of this research, it was portrayed as a way to increase biodiversity in the fields, in the vineyards. Biodiversity doesn't resonate with farmers. Farmers were concerned with water loss. If they had cover crops, would that take up more water, or would it preserve more water in the soil? They're concerned with soil loss and erosion. They want to make sure that whatever happens, their erosion is mitigated. And what's interesting is that these two variables most likely correlate positively to increase in biodiversity. That is, increase in biodiversity with cover crops. The same cover crops are limiting water loss and are limiting erosion, although not in every ecosystem type. But in the case of the Northern Galilee, where we were working, the same objectives could be met through cover crops. Water efficiency, conservation, soil conservation, and a rise in biodiversity. As soon as we changed the discourse around terminology that concerned the farmers more, they became more amenable to these changes. And of course, we asked the ecological research team at that point and the viticulturists to also monitor water loss and soil loss, because if those turned out to respond positively to cover crops, then the farmers would be even more enthusiastic about making this transition. So the success indicators for this project were that all the winery fields were eventually converted to cover crops. Herbicide applications were drastically reduced. Additional wineries started joining the trend. So now there are 2,000 hectares, or at least a year ago when I made this slide, there were 2,000 hectares that have already transitioned to cover crops. And we've realized the synergistic benefits, not just the protection of biodiversity, but the control of erosion and the conservation of water. What made the project a success? In our interpretation, because the subjects were relevant to the farmer and to the environmental organization and to the winery. We had clear and tangible goals that weren't always the same for the ecological community and the farmers, although once we could bring those into alignment, there was greater potential to move forward. So we had buy-in from the farmers. We assured that they were participating in the process. Also through our interviews with the farmers, by the way, using qualitative research methods is another way of integrating stakeholders into scientific activity. through an iterative and responsive program. That is, we didn't just do the research and leave. We did the research, we communicated the research, we adapted the research, and continued on. The dedicated and charismatic leadership, as it turns out, in most case studies of sustainability in agriculture and in other areas, there's very, very often someone from the community that all the stakeholders can relate with, who are very dedicated over the long term and charismatic and move these projects forward. So that's just an additional aspect of any community sustainability initiative. Often has a charismatic individual that is engaged in the long term with the community and has helped shepherd this process towards greater sustainability. And of course, funding support, which is always important. Now to the final portion, we'll talk a few minutes about how social ecology is expressed in the LTER research infrastructure. First, we'll talk about the platform. The platform is the geographically specific region in which social ecological research is to take place. In comparison to LTER research sites that do observations and research, which are called sites, which are instrumented, which monitor particular ecological variables over the long term, which facilitate different research activities. These are varying degrees of instrumentation. This is a geographic area that includes human communities and human activities, whether that's farming or hunting or tourism or mining or residential areas. A platform includes ecological monitoring sites and the human communities that live in the region. And that already facilitates for looking at interactions between land use change, economic changes, demographic changes, and the changes of various ecological variables. So it's very important to set up kind of the geographic framework. And these platforms, 80 or so platforms, are spread across Europe, from northern Scandinavia to the southernmost platforms, which are in the hyper-arid Arava Valley in Israel. These are places where we will harmonize data collection, socio-ecological data collection, so that research can be facilitated within the individual platforms and between and across platforms to compare processes across different ecosystem types and different political and economic regimes across Europe. My colleague, Dr. Jennifer Holzer, compared a platform to a bicycle to talk about how each individual component, the wheels are the research, the gears are the research team, the oil is the funding, et cetera, You need all these parts for the bicycle to function. If one of them is lacking, then there can be problems in making social ecological research work because it's a team effort. It's an involved and long-term effort that requires not just various forms of disciplinary expertise. It requires also stakeholder engagement, of course, a research infrastructure and funding, et cetera. And just to give a couple pictures of what a platform could look like, actually, in retrospect, I shouldn't have chosen just aquatic environments, because all of these are aquatic environments. There are certainly terrestrial and even mountain and desert environments as well, but these are 4 examples of some of the platforms across Europe. In recent years, we're pushing forward and advancing the state of social ecology within LTSER through our work on significantly upgrading the research infrastructure now that we are on the European Strategy Forum for Research Infrastructures, the ESFRI roadmap. We have received 2 major grants from Horizon 2020. One is called the Preparatory Phase Project, which works on the administrative and physical development of the research infrastructure, and then eLTER Plus in parallel, which is funding exemplary research, not just socio-ecological, but also socio-ecological research in the research infrastructure. That research is taking place in 3 tracks: data collection, harmonization of data collection across research platforms in Europe, actual research to exemplify how one does research on social ecological systems, and to assure policy relevance of the work we're doing from the local to the national to the continental scale. So within eLTER Plus, the funding is going to those 3 activities: data collection, research, policy relevancy. Social ecology within eLTER Plus is one of 4 major themes or research challenges that we're focusing on across all of the sites and platforms, or across many of the sites and platforms, looking at biodiversity loss, looking at biogeochemical controls of ecosystem function, looking at the climate, water, food nexus, and looking at socio-ecological systems, or in particular, looking at human impacts on biophysical variables and their feedbacks on human well-being. All of that, of course, builds and utilizes the interdisciplinary approach of eLTER-RI, the demand for large spatial coverage and temporal and deep temporal coverage of different ecosystems across Europe, and integrating all of the various disciplinary expertise in looking at the whole systems, and the whole systems meaning from the bedrock and up to the atmosphere, and including the social systems. With regard to data collection, we are looking at 3 types of data that we want to establish permanent and long-term monitoring of these data sources. And these include specifically social data, specifically biophysical data that has a direct bearing on social systems, and the interaction variables between them. The slide has several examples. For lack of time, I'll continue on, or I'll refer you directly to Dr. Jan Dick's lecture, which focuses specifically about the aspect of data collection within eLTER Plus, and is enlightening in this, so it's recommended as well. And the research aspect of social ecology in eLTER Plus, where it's integrated. In this slide, you can see it to the right side, where the themes integrate different aspects of ecosystem types, of communities, and looking both in depth and breadth across ecosystem types. I'm going to leave this as a bit complicated, but we can expand on that if there are questions. Leave them down in the questions. And don't forget to like eLTER videos. Finally, there's a community aspect of this, what we call the RI ecosystem. And being responsible for the social ecology aspect of eLTER also means connecting to other projects, other research infrastructures, other stakeholder communities, in order to both integrate their needs, to monitor their needs and interests and demands for eLTER products, and also to make sure that eLTER products are accessible to those communities, so that there's uptake in the data and the research that we're producing, and also so that we can steer our research program towards the policy needs of the European community. Again, from the local scale to the national scale and up to the EU scale. And here you see the research themes represented as gear wheels. That is moving the process of connecting between the research and the stakeholder communities, and also interacting with one another to assure that whole systems approach. This is just an advertisement for any of the audience that may be interested in doing their own research within our research platforms. There's funding available for transnational access, or for visiting, or for remote access, for gaining the data that's produced. Again, the idea here is that these platforms exist for the service of the broader community. And the research conducted there is research that's designed for the to contribute to the policy community as well. Some of the articles, we've produced a manual of best practices manual, how to conduct socio-ecological research. A lot of publications from here too come out from our research. And lastly, the interaction between the broader LTSER RI and the individual platforms. And this is always a matter of negotiation, because platforms themselves, by definition, have to create themselves in the image of the region where they are embedded, so that they can be full and active contributing members of the community. But at the same time, at the continental scale, we are looking to harmonize the activities so that we can utilize the presence of platforms across ecosystem types to understand more human environment interactions across all sorts of ecosystem types. So there's a little tension there, but there's an interaction between this kind of bottom-up desire to be part of the community and top-down desire to be a harmonized and unified network. And this is one of the challenges, of course, of socio-ecological research in general. Some examples: it's all about people and environment. These are all, we do a lot of citizen science. We do certainly stakeholder engagement, a lot of consultations. And with that, and in hopes that all of this will lead to strengthening our contribution to meeting those original global environmental challenges, we of course welcome you to inquire, to participate, to conduct research in the RI. We're here for you. Here are some readings regarding how social ecology takes place in LTSER RI. You're welcome to consult, and thank you very much.